What's up, everybody? My name is Daniel Unmanageable, and welcome once again to Hard Knox Talks. Tonight's guest has a powerful energy. I don't think he knew that I could see what he was doing before the show, but I noticed he was smudging, and I'm not sure if he was praying or maybe it's bold of me to say something like that, but it was a very powerful moment for me to see such a grounded and powerful person, and I'm honored to have him on. So let's bring him on. Here we are. What's up, Forrest?
Hey, Daniel. How you doing, man?
I'm doing well. I've never really had anybody tell me when I ask them about their story. Usually it starts when they were young in the home. Now with you say that it started years and years before you were born.
Yeah, that's right.
And I didn't fully understand that, but when we started talking, it made a lot of sense. And it's a very powerful story. And many Canadians should certainly have heard about these things by now. But why don't you tell us a little bit about it? Where does your story start?
Yeah, so like you mentioned, my story, I consider my story to start way before I was born, and I think that's an important piece to talk about because the path that I went down, it was inherited. There's a term called intergenerational trauma, and it's kind of a similar sort of idea as how they say alcoholism and drug addiction is a family disease.
Yeah.
This intergenerational trauma I inherited and is a direct result of colonization. And the reason, it goes deeper beyond 1950, but 1950 is for me where my understanding of who I am begins. And that was when my grandmother was born. My grandmother on my mom's side, she's the one that raised me. And my grandmother, she was part of the 60 Scoop, and she was a residential school survivor.
So what's the 60 Scoop? For anybody that might not know.
Yeah, the 60 Scoop was basically a government mandated program to take children from their homes and put them in foster homes with white families. And these were Indigenous children, right? And so what had happened to my grandmother was she was very badly abused by her mother, and she had ended up kind of crawling to the side of a road after a really, really bad beating, and she ended up getting picked up by a couple of farmers. And so that started her stay in foster cares and residential schools right up until she was about 12 years old. And at 12 years old, she had ran away enough times that they just didn't try and find her. And so she was on her own from 12. And, my grandmother struggled for a really long time with her addictions. She was a drug addict. She was an alcoholic. And then she had some kids. She had 2 girls. One of those girls was my mother, and my mother was raised in a very dysfunctional home where my mother never had a childhood. My mother, well, it means that my mother had to take care of her younger sister because her mother was out drinking and was out, just not taking care of her children was what it was. And so, a lot of the stories and stuff that I've been told sort of come around to certain gang members and stuff would come by the house and drop off money for my mom, who was maybe 7 or 8 at the time, to go and buy groceries because they knew where my grandma was. She was out partying, she was out drinking, she was out, she was out medicating. That's what she was doing because there was a lot of trauma that she was dealing with.
Yeah.
And so because of that experience, my mother never really learned how to be a mother, because she didn't have anybody to really model after. And so that created a lot of trauma within my mom, you know. And she was a young mom. She had me when she was 19. And, you know, my own trauma started at 8 months in the womb.
Yeah. Where
my mother endured a pretty vicious assault that left her in the hospital. And so that's sort of where my trauma, why my direct trauma starts, is there, you know, because they say that, you know, when you're in the womb, you're absorbing what your mother does. You know, that's why it's important for mothers to eat right and to rest and to not, you know, not smoke and not drink. And again, this is, I just want to say that's not judgment by any means. I understand, you know, like these things happen.
Yeah.
But when you're in the womb, you absorb those things.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so I just remember being, you know, I never really felt safe or secure in my life, you know. And so when I was born, my mother, she took me and we ran off to Surrey, BC, just her and I, you know, and she was full-time student, full-time work, full-time mom. And
what schooling did she take?
She took a lot of different school. You know, I think at that time she was going out for her education degree. Because she worked in the education field for a while until eventually she became an addictions counselor, which is going to sort of come into the story a little bit further ahead here.
Oh, she's doing some things right here, by the sounds of things.
My mom really tried, man. She, like, there was, you know, she did the best that she could. And, you know, today me and my mother have a great relationship. We get along really well now, but a big piece of that is because we're both sober, you know. And so my mom, because of where she grew up.
How long has she been sober?
Well, she had some sobriety on and off, and, you know, she's had her own things. And right now I know she just celebrated a year not too long ago.
Right on, man.
And so, you know, it was really cool. I got to be at my mom's 1 year. She was at my 1 year. Yeah. We got to zoom in because she's in amazing. Calgary. Yeah. So I got to see you guys. That's awesome. It was incredible, man. I'm very, very proud of my mom. I'm actually getting shivers thinking about it. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, so she, you know, because of everything that she had gone through and what she did, she also, you know, she had her issues with addictions, you know. And so when I was about 4 years old, my mom, she shacked up with her drug dealer.
Oh, no.
She shacked up with her drug dealer, who actually ended up becoming the man that raised me. And so around that time, we're gonna get heavy right away here, because at 4 years old, this was the first time that I was sexually abused. And my abuser was a boy who was a couple of years older than me. And he had been abused himself. You know, and that's an important thing, I think, for me to mention, because it took a lot of healing to get to that point where I was able to have compassion, mm-hmm. you know, where I was able to understand what was going on, you know. And, you know, it just, when I sort of reflect on that whole time, you know, with sort of the understanding that we already have about where I came from, it just sort of added to this deeply ingrained feeling that I wasn't safe. You know, that I wasn't secure, that I couldn't trust anybody. And so, you know, that sort of set the tone, I guess, for, even till today, that sort of set this tone. I still have some serious trust issues. I still don't always feel secure. I always feel, you know, I have a lot of abandonment things that I'm still trying to work through, you know?
Yeah. So, yeah. And you lived in a rough part of Calgary too, hey?
Yeah. So I lived in a part of Calgary where you would, when you would meet people from other parts of Calgary, because Calgary is interesting. It's separated into quarters. You know, there's the northeast, the southeast, the northwest, and the southwest.
Is that what you're talking about in your song, Between the Ditches?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about.
I knew it.
Yeah. And so the part that I lived in was kind of the part when you told people that were from other parts of the city where you lived, you know, they kind of, you know, they had their judgments, you know, and that was a place they didn't want to go. And I mean, I got to be honest, though, like when I was growing up, I didn't really think about it that way. you know, where I was living. That's just where we lived, you know, that was just my neighborhood. You don't really know when you're a kid, you can't really, there's no context for anything other than what you know.
Yeah, you've never really ventured out of that area, correct? And until a little later on.
Yeah.
So what was it like making friends and going to school and stuff in that part of town and at that age?
It was interesting, you know, because like I was, so in my home, right, I mentioned my mom shacking up with her drug dealer. He became, you know, like I said, he's the man that raised me. That's that's my dad, you know. And he was a rig worker. That's what he did. He worked in the oil patch. And he also was an addict and an alcoholic. And at that time, my mom was sober, because my mom was sober for about 20 years. And that was a really difficult thing for her to be in, because, you know, she was in this relationship with someone that she was trying to fix.
Right.
You know, and so I had a very strict yet very loose and inconsistent upbringing.
That's kind of contradictory.
Very contradictory. Yeah, very contradictory. And it was really difficult for me to figure out, you know, kind of what way was up and, you know, what way was down.
Go ahead.
And so like the neighborhood that I grew up in and the friends that I had, you know, we were all like, I hung out with kids from my neighborhood. You know, that was it. There was kids from my neighborhood, and it didn't really matter. Like, I guess there was this sense in my neighborhood where it didn't really matter like how old somebody was, or, you know, and there was a lot of cultures around too. There was a lot of cultures around. And so for me, being somebody who was as far as I can recall, the only Indigenous person around me, you know, I didn't grow up with Indigenous people. I grew up separated from my culture. I grew up separated from, you know, any sort of life as an Indigenous person, other than my own experience as an Indigenous person. And so I sort of fit into places wherever I could go, you know, because that part of Calgary was very secluded, you know, like you had people really hung out with people of their own kind. And so I sort of ended up hanging out with people who were sort of misfits, or also just sort of maybe just, you know, they were a little bit more open-minded, I suppose. And yeah, it was really tough though, because I did anything and everything that I could to be liked and accepted.
Yeah. So was there opportunities to hang out with, like, you know, like there's, and I asked this to all of my guests. I mean, was there the jocks and the band kids and the skater kids, and did you just naturally gravitate towards the drug users and I don't want to say hooligans, but yeah.
You know, I mean, there was all of that, right? Like when I went to school in Calgary when I was growing up, it really hit in junior high. You know, they don't have that here, but junior high in Alberta is like grade 7 to grade 9. And that was where like social constructs really started to matter. And but the thing was it didn't matter who I was hanging out with, because I was a jock. I was also a skater kid. I was also a band kid. I was also, you know, but then I also, like what you said, I also hung out with like the hooligans, I suppose. But the thing was that almost everybody around me, didn't matter what they were, everybody partied, you know, everybody drank, everybody did drugs. Like, it didn't matter if you were a jock or if you were like preppy or if you were a skater, like everybody did that. So it didn't really matter where I went, that was around.
Yeah. So, and then you, how old were you when you came to Saskatoon from Calgary? How old were you when that happened?
I came to Saskatoon in 2005, I believe. So I would have been about, I want to say I would have been about 15 or 16. It was between grade 9 and grade 10, that summer in between when we moved out here.
And were you glad to get out of Calgary, and like, were you excited to get here, or did you like where you were?
I mean, there were parts of it that I was excited to leave. You know, like I said, I never really felt safe. And the areas where I lived, there was a lot of gangs. You know, there's a lot of gang activity around. And I was not in a gang. You know, I don't ever want to get that twisted by any means to think that I was some gangster, because I wasn't. But there was a lot of gangs around. And so I was really happy to not have to worry about the stress of that. And I ended up, you know, part of the reason that we left Saskatoon was because I had gotten in so much trouble.
You mean Calgary?
Where we left Calgary was because I had gotten in so much trouble, you know. That was a big part of it. And so I was happy about that, but also like I was a big city kid, and then my parents moved me to an acreage outside by Pike Lake, and so it was like the exact opposite, and I wasn't happy about that.
Yeah. So how did you handle that? It must have been a pretty big shock for you.
It was, yeah, it really was. One of the first things that was really shocking to me was it was a culture shock. Because where I lived, like I was used to seeing, you know, various brown faces around me.
Okay.
You know, and then I moved to Saskatoon, and that wasn't the case. You know, that wasn't the case at all. So that was very strange. And it was just the seclusion. You know, but you know, I mentioned my dad worked in the rig, so. My dad made some pretty good money. You know, that was the thing. So my dad bought us all kinds of cool stuff. We had dirt bikes, and he bought me a drum kit, which I had always really wanted to do, was have my own drum kit. And, you know, they tried to do things to keep me entertained, you know, so that was kind of cool. And we also had horses and like that kind of stuff, but it took me a while to really get used to it.
Yeah. And the people that you ended up meeting, and the groups you started spending time with, they didn't drink. Correct?
It was weird, man. Yeah. So when I moved to Saskatoon, right? So 13 years old, I didn't have a first left. You know, 13 years old, I had been high, I had been drunk, I had sex. And then I moved here, and I'm going into grade 10, and nobody around me had done that. And that was sort of like the first point where I realized that maybe the way I was living wasn't normal. You know, so when I moved, so in grade 10, that was the first time I tried to sober up.
Okay. So at the time, did you realize like, okay, maybe I am doing terrible things, and, you know, maybe I should stop? Or was it like, well, no one else is doing it, so I'm not going to do it?
It was that. Yeah, it was more so that. It was like I said, I would have done anything to fit in. You know, I had serious self-esteem issues. I had serious, you know, self-worth issues. And so I did whatever everybody else did. And so, it was easy in a sense at that time to like sober up because no one else was doing it. And I was much more concerned with,
what
fitting
other people thought. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
I feel that, man. So life was good for a little while.
I mean, yes and no. I was kind of a weird kid too, right? Like
we were all weird kids, man. We were all weird kids.
Yeah, we were all weird kids. And like I have to say though, is like I found that I never really fit in with people here when I first moved here, because I don't know, I just came from a very different place. You know, that's all it was. I came from a very different place. So I had a really hard time fitting in. And so, you know, I started experiencing bullying. I also at times would become a bully because, you know, hurt people. And so it was, you know, and I had, it's really hard to say whether or not it was good. It wasn't ever really good, to be honest. School life was weird. Home life was always really weird because, you know, my dad was really battling his cocaine addiction at that time. When we first moved. And so I was dealing with that at home, and, you know, my mom, with her tendencies as well, became very, very controlling. Because that was the only thing she knew how to do, right? Was just clamp down on the situation. You know, and that'll stop the hurt or stop the pain or whatever. But, you know, it didn't exactly, it didn't really make things better.
Yeah. So time goes on, and the friends that weren't drinking discover drinking.
Yep.
So
as
what does
teenagers do?
Yeah, absolutely. So Forrest is like, ha ha ha.
Yeah.
What was that like for you?
Oh, it was great.
Yeah.
It was great. You know, we were drinking and we were partying again, and it seemed like it was all, you know, it was all good. I don't know. I mean,
You're home.
I'm home. It's
Yeah,
fine.
man. Mm-hmm.
You know, and I mean, it just brought me back to a place where, yeah, like I could do this. You know, that was the thing. That was always the thing for me was, you know, because I started partying and drinking in junior high, and I always drank with older kids because I could drink with them.
You could keep
You
up.
know, I could keep up. My first experience being drunk was beer bonging wine.
Oh.
You know, yeah, and I mean, I'm pretty sure they thought it was going to be really funny, like after one, but no, I ended up beer bonging 4 bottles of wine. What 13-year-old kid can beer bong 4 bottles of wine? And I still remember that whole night. You know, like Forrest can, and so that sort of set the tone, right? And so.
Yeah.
When cut to high school, when everyone starts drinking, yeah, I'm there and I can drink a lot still. You know, my tolerance never went away.
And at that age, that's cool. People look up at you for being able to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So did your dad ever endorse your substance use? You mentioned he struggled his own struggles. Now, was that in the home? Did he ever do that with you?
We drank together.
Yeah.
Yeah, we drank together. Alcohol was never a problem in my dad's eyes, you know. But he always warned me about hard drugs. You know, that was the thing. And so a combination of my dad talking to me about hard drugs and really just like he really did put the fear into me about hard drugs. So having that and then seeing him go through it and experiencing those feelings firsthand as well, you know, like being 13 or 14 years old and seeing your dad come stumbling through the house after being gone for 2 weeks and thousands of dollars gone. And he left at, you know, $250, comes back at $160, and he's all cut up and he's all beat up and he's all red in the eyes. And all he can do is look in the eyes and say, I'm sorry. You know, that prevented me from going into hard drugs. But like I said, me and my dad drank together.
Yeah.
And the irony of that is that alcohol was the biggest problem for both of us.
That's interesting. It was around that time that you started playing in bands and started performing at youth centers and things, or where were you? How did a band come to be?
Well, my like I've always been a performer. My mom was really good at keeping me involved in things. So I've been performing since the age of 5. You know, and I was acting. I was a bit of a childhood actor, acting on television. And so and then my parents, my music journey started when I was 12 years old. My parents, in a fleeting attempt to get some discipline into me, put me into cadets. And cadets have marching bands, and I discovered the drums. And so, you know, that became a constructive thing for me, you know, that ended up being a thing that I really enjoyed doing. It made sense. Out of everything else in my life that made 0 sense, music seemed to be the one thing that made sense to me. I could see myself doing that. And I didn't have any vision for myself. You know, I didn't have any vision for myself. I didn't know what the future was going to look like. I didn't expect to be alive, you know, like I really didn't.
Yeah.
And, but music was the one thing where I was doing that. And I was like, I could do this. You know, I feel like a whole different person that I don't even know yet, you know? And so, like, you know, playing in cadets was the thing. And then I started really playing in bands when I was about 15, you know, playing drums in bands, and yeah, sort of getting involved in like the local kind of hardcore scene out here. There was a couple of youth spots that were, that would have shows every weekend. Le Relais was a spot that we used to play at, which was a little venue downtown. There was like the Cosmos Senior Center where they had shows, the Sutherland Hall, they'd have shows. You know, we played the odd show at like Walker's nightclub when that was a thing.
I remember Walker's.
Yeah. And so there would like, so I really got involved in that. I found some friends that, you know, needed a drummer, and we just, you know, we got to it.
So did you find stability in that, or did it like put you in places where you found even more alcohol and substances?
I mean, yeah, music and alcohol and drugs, they all kind of go hand in hand, you know?
Mhm.
And so it was just another place, but it didn't feel the same, right? Like it didn't feel like I was just partying. It didn't feel like I was, because we were playing music and we were creating while we're,
Yeah.
getting drunk and we're getting high and we're playing music. And so it definitely music definitely brought that stuff to me, but it felt different, it felt different.
Yeah. So and time goes on. You turn bar age, and now you are playing in bars, and there is drugs, and there is booze, and there is women. I mean, where did your ego go with all of that?
Oh man, it exploded. It
Like, did that?
exploded.
Did it just feel like a day in the life, or were you like, I'm on top of the world?
I really did feel on top of the world, man. Like, I remember the first time that I ever got offered a bar gig,
Were you bar age?
and I was not bar age. No, I
Did
was
you
not.
take the gig?
I did play the gig. They didn't know I wasn't bar age,
They
and
didn't
so
ask.
they didn't ask. I didn't tell.
Uh-huh.
And so the first time I ever played a bar gig was the first time I realized that people would compensate me for my performance with an open tab.
You're not the first musician I've had on this show that says that.
It was
Like, well,
life
you want to
changing.
talk? You want to talk about an occupational hazard? Like, holy cow!
Yeah, music is the only job in the world, I swear. I mean, apart from other like entertainment jobs, but music is one of the only jobs in the world where it's not only is it accepted, but in a lot of ways it's almost perpetuated to be
Welding is
intoxicated.
like that too.
Welding is like that too. My dad, that was the thing. I was actually writing a song about this last night about his journey. And one of the things he always told me was, you got your next job by going out and doing coke and drinking all night with the boss of the job you want.
Yeah, and I got paid doing like I used to weld out of my garage. I got paid all the time with a bag of weed or a case of beer, or it was just normal.
It was normal. Yeah. Um, and so, yeah, it was groundbreaking for me
Yeah.
because now my ego is huge because I'm still like, through all of this, I think it's really worth mentioning that like through all of this up to this point, my self-worth kept getting lower and lower and lower. And so the natural effect of that is my ego gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and more inflated the worse I feel about myself.
Yeah. And
And
it's almost as though, like, did you realize at the time that you became, I would say, almost addicted to this attention? Like you needed that attention to feel like Forrest?
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But I didn't look at it like that. I looked at it like I'm a performer. I'm an entertainer.
Mm-hmm.
I just like the attention because that's what entertainers and performers do. You
And
know,
you thought you knew who you were. You thought this is who I am.
I thought I knew who I was. I really
Yeah.
did. Yeah.
Yeah. So time goes on, and suddenly Saskatoon is not big enough. Is that correct?
Well, that's not 100% wrong.
So
That
off you go to
was
Calgary. Let's go back to Calgary.
Go back to Calgary, and
Yeah.
there was a couple of reasons for that, though. Like my partner, who I'm still with today, Nevada, she got accepted into art school in Calgary, and my grandmother was sick, and so it seemed to just be like this thing where it was like, I need, Saskatoon isn't big enough for this ego, and then I can, we can go to school there. My partner can go to school there. I can go take care of my grandmother, and then I can really go and I can make a run at this music thing.
And you did.
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly what we did. We went out there and just like I slipped right back into the old. I slipped right back into the old. I was right back in the same neighborhood with the same people who I had left, and they were doing the same things, but now we're just older.
With more resources.
Way more resources. Yeah.
Money, cars, stuff.
Yeah. And I mean, like my first night back in Calgary was spent in a bar. You know, that was like the first night there. We went and we got drunk, like right the first night.
Yeah. And in the exact same hood.
Yeah. In the exact same place.
You knew everybody. It was just like old days.
It was exactly like that, you know, except I was different, you know, because when I left, I was a very, without booze, I was a very kind of, I don't want to say timid, but a very insecure person. And I was very easily pushed around. But when I came back, that was different because my ego had gotten so big. I had been playing in these bands and, you know, I felt like that made me somebody. And so my relationships had changed with some of these people.
And you when you left Calgary, you were 13 years old. When you came back, I mean, you were grown.
Yeah, we moved back. I think I was 20 when I got back to Calgary.
Yeah. So you're a big guy now.
Yeah, not only had I grown up, but I had grown out as well. You know, when I left Calgary, I was probably about like 5'6", like 120 pounds. When I came back, I was like just under 6 foot, and I was probably weighing like 230, 240 pounds. So I was a lot bigger.
Damn.
Yeah, and that fed me too. You know, that fed me too because always my thing was I was always so insecure about being so small. But then the catch to that is then I got bigger and then I was insecure about that.
Yeah. Well, when we talked the other day, I'm like, so did you start carrying weapons? I mean, you're back with the old crowd doing the old things. And what did you say to me?
No, I didn't carry weapons, man. I was a weapon. That was how I felt. I felt like I didn't need none of that. And you know, part of that though does come from my upbringing with my dad. You know, my dad was a fighter and my dad glorified violence. Mm-hmm. But he also, you know, my dad caught a charge for armed robbery and assault on a police officer. And so that was another thing that he always talked to me about was weapons. And he sort of had this idea that it was like, you know, if you need a gun, you know, then you're not tough, you know. And that was my dad always pushed that, like, you be tough.
And in a way, maybe that's not the worst thing. I mean, hell, you'd have been carrying a gun around. Who knows where you'd ended up? So,
yeah, I mean, a piece of that is like me leaving Calgary at the time that I did. I can look back at it now, and I don't think I would have made 18 if I would have stayed in Calgary. The way that I was going, it wouldn't have mattered any of those lessons. I think the fact that I was able to be separated from that, isolated on you know 11.5 acres, mm-hmm. that changed me. You know, that changed me a lot. And so a lot of those things, they had time to sink in, whether I wanted them to or not.
So you're doing all these things. You go back to Calgary and you start a band in the middle of all this. Hey River. My apologies.
Hey River. Yeah, no, yeah. It was a band that I had formed. I had ran into an old friend of mine selling sunglasses. He was selling sunglasses and I was going to buy some, and I ran into him, and you know, we used to play in cadet bands together.
Like in a store?
In a store, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, in a store, yeah. And I had stopped drumming and I had started playing guitar and singing. You know, I started doing that in my grade 12 year. I had this incredible music teacher. Her name was Miss Ani, and I wasn't allowed to take a spare in grade 12 because I barely passed. You know, I was like 50% and I'm good, you know? Yeah. And so I wasn't allowed to take a spare. So I got put into a guitar 30 class, and I had never taken guitar. So this music teacher was awesome because what she did is she put me in a practice room by myself with a guitar, and she told me, whatever you want to learn, I'm going to grade you on that. And like, as soon as I learned my first, you know, set of chords, I was writing songs. So really the reason, like a big reason as to why I am where I am today with music and as a songwriter is because of that pivotal moment where she decided to not just to not just, to just write me off and stick me in the class and watch me struggle, but she worked with me,
She nurtured you. She nurtured your skills.
Absolutely. And so when I got to Calgary, I was playing guitar, I was singing, I was songwriting. And then like I said, I ran into a friend of mine. He was selling sunglasses at a store. He was still drumming. And it was probably like, maybe even like the week after, because we lived in the same neighborhood too. He lived like 3 blocks away from me, the house that I moved back into. And so we started jamming right away, and he had some friends. And so, yeah, we formed this little band called Hey River. Mm-hmm. And we started just like, tackling the Calgary music scene, writing songs.
You did some things with this band.
We did some cool stuff. We really got into like the local circuit really quick. We had a couple of places that would book us no matter what. And I think kind of at our pinnacle was we got to open up for Buck Cherry during Stampede at the Calgary Cowboys tent. It was like a 10,000 person capacity tent, and it was sold out. There was people all the way to the back. And so, yeah, we got to do that, and things were really rolling for us. We had got into the studio and we were ready to cut a record, and it all fell apart. It all fell apart.
And why is that?
Because I was an angry egomaniac with a drinking problem. And I was very
angry egomaniac.
The worst kind. And I was very hard to be around. I was very hard to be around. I had super unrealistic expectations. Mm-hmm. I pushed people really hard. And yeah, then I would get drunk and I would just be unruly, just so much to deal with. And then so slowly after about 2 years of us playing together, it all sort of came down. And it was like this sort of this thing where we knew it was coming to an end. The band practices started off at the very beginning as so much fun and amazing. We loved it. And by the end of it, we weren't even talking. We would show up, plug in, play the songs, and then go. But all the other guys would stay and hang out after I'd left, Mm-hmm. So they all had great relationships. I was the problem. And I wasn't able to admit that before, but I can totally look at that now and see that I was the problem,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that band breaks up. Then what?
So at the time, my partner and I are living with my manager at the time, and his name is Damien Mustafi. And he was a manager and a mentor and just a guy that really he really believed in me as a musician and as a human being. And so I remember leaving the band, the jam space after we had split, and we got drunk. That was what we did. We had a party. I invited everyone over that I possibly could because, there was no shortage of people looking for a place to party. Mm-hmm. And we had a party. And out of spite, that very same night, sitting around a fire in our backyard, after everyone had either gone home or passed out, Damien and I were sitting around, and we were naming the North Sound. That's what we were doing. We named the North Sound, the project that I have now. We named it, and that was sort of where it started. And it's really funny to look back and realize that the roots of this project, the project where I use my voice to share stories and uplift, and it's this sober, clean sort of unit, and it's family oriented. It started out of spite, drunk around a fire at 5 a.m.
Yeah. Resentment and intoxication was the beginning of the North Sound. That's amazing. I love it though.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
Like what a rich story, like that's just, I love that, man. I love it. Okay. So the new project, so now you've got this project named. So what does the North Sound mean to you? Like at the time when you're in the grips of all of this, what did it mean to you? I mean, the name doesn't just come out of thin air. Surely it has meaning to it.
Yeah. So one of the big things for me was that From my own experience with the numerous bands that I'd already been into up to that point, I recognized that I was always I was always one of the people at the front of the band trying to push it forward, you know, because like I said, music was the thing. It was the only thing that I ever was able to really look at and go, I could do this for the, you know, gave me a reason to want to live longer. And so I didn't want to have a project where it was reliant on anybody or anything, you know, because I was so many times we'd start making ground and then a person would leave and then, you know, we'd have to restart or get kicked out of a band and all my hard work is gone, you know? So I wanted something that would be sustainable, that no matter what happened, whether it was me or me and one other person or me and, you know, 5 other people, it could still move forward. And so the North Sound sort of came out as the name because, you know, we were sort of really just tinkering around with like directions and that sort of thing. And Damien sort of just, I don't even really know where it came from, but he just said, you know, what about like the North Sound, you know? And immediately what popped into my head was the question, you know, what is the North Sound? And that sort of right there, that was it for me, because that checked that box for me, you know, because it didn't matter what the North Sound was, it just is, you know.
That's awesome, man. Now you're making music, you're gathering musicians, and then you lose someone.
Yeah, so you know, I had mentioned that one of the reasons that we had moved out to Calgary was because my grandmother was sick. And so, you know, in 2015, my grandmother, you know, she went to the hospital. She was in there for a couple months and she never ended up going back home. And I was at a band practice. I had spent the afternoon with my grandmother in the hospital. And I need to put this out there, is that like my grandmother, she was, you know, she was my person. She was the only place in the world, or the only person in the world who I never felt judgment from.
Safe place to land.
Always safe, you know, and she was no matter what I was doing, you know, there were so many times where I'd show up at her house just blacked out and angry, and she never, you know, there was always a spot to lay beside her in her bed for me to cry, you know. And so I was at a band practice and I'd spent the afternoon with my grandma and we knew she wasn't doing well. And yeah, I was at band practice and I had just plugged my guitar in. We had just sort of started going and my phone rings and they said that my grandma passed. And so we, my partner and I, we headed to the hospital and everybody was there. And sorry, my mom, or my grandma, she was the glue, you know, she was the glue that held our family together. And so almost instantaneously, my whole family fell apart, you know. And so I did what I do best, you know. I started drinking, or I shouldn't say started, I kept drinking, and it just escalated, you know. I just kept drinking more and more. And now it was really, the drinking felt really gross. It felt really bad, you know, because one of the last conversations that I had had with my grandmother was her telling me that she needed me to get sober. You know, my grandmother, she sobered up when I was born. You know, that was when she entered into recovery. And then I think, yeah, when I was about 5 or 6, she was done. You know, she had completely stopped and she died sober. So yeah, it felt very different. It felt very sad, my drinking. And then this was sort of a point where my drinking was every day. Yeah. It was absolutely every day. I would I would wake up to, and I mean, these things were already sort of starting. I was already, progressively, because like the natural progression of alcoholism has already started taking its course, so it wasn't like I went from just partying on the weekends, having fun, to drinking every day. No, there was, it was a progression. I had already started, but then it was just like, it was cemented.
Yeah.
I drank every day. And I would use smoking weed as a justification as to why I wasn't an alcoholic, because I didn't wake up in the morning and get drunk. I waited until after I was done work to start drinking.
Right.
But like,
Yeah.
I
Were
never,
you smoking weed during the day then?
I never woke up without getting high first.
Yeah.
It wasn't even a wake and bake. It was like a bake then wake for me, like that's what it really was like. I was high all the time.
Yeah.
And so, but that was the justification for me, right? And then whenever I had hangovers or anything, I wouldn't drink my hangovers away, but I would smoke them away. And so the weed smoking was really, it was just a justification. It was just me lying to myself.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, like every day I would get off work after, and I like, this is the part of my story that I'm definitely not super proud of, but, I had a job where I was working with vulnerable populations, and I was, working with these people just high all the time,
Mm-hmm.
And I look back at that, and yeah, there's definitely like, that's not a good way to be. That's not a good way to be. That's super irresponsible. And it really just shows like the carelessness that I had,
Mm-hmm.
and that was really just accentuated when Grandma passed, because then it was like, I just lost it,
Yeah. So there was, you mentioned the other day, you used the term violently drunk, and completely unhinged. And this went on until 2015. What happened in 2015?
Well, like I mentioned, my grandmother passed in 2015.
Oh,
but that wasn't, well, you're on the right track, because
good.
My grandmother passed in it's either March or May. I'm really, really bad with dates. It's either the end of March or the end of May. That same year, my dad suicided, and this was in November. And I was at a gig. I was in Calgary. My dad was alone on our family farm in Saskatoon. Him and my mom had split, and I was, my mom and my brother were living in Calgary with us. I was taking care of them. I was taking care of I was taking care of a bunch of stuff. And my dad, I called him end of May. Thank you, Tracy. So I was at a show, and I sort of had this ritual with my dad. It wasn't really anything we ever set in stone. It was just sort of something that ended up happening. Is I would be at a show, and I would call him up, and see, April 30th. See, I knew it was April or March. Okay.
You got a lot of support tonight, man. You got a lot of support in the chat.
Yeah, there's lots of family here. I'm seeing that. That's amazing. I'm really happy that y'all are here. And so I'm at a show, and like I said, we had this ritual. So I called him, and he didn't answer. So we go on, we play our show, and like sometimes my dad answered, sometimes he wouldn't. He was always out in the yard doing something, and he was kind of an old school cat, so it was like his phone wasn't always on his hip. He would leave his phone down for hours and never even think about it. And after the show, I had called him again after we performed, and he didn't answer. And I called him. I think the last time I called him was around 11:30, and they think that he did his deed just after midnight. So it was, and then the term violently drunk. This is when it all. This is when my drunks stopped being sad well, they stopped being like, they stopped feeling gross and sort of weird, and they started feeling like, just like I was angry at the world. I was so angry. And then I started, violently drunk. That was what it was. I quit my job to stay home and drink. And I just, those years, they're very, there's a lot in there, and I don't even really know how to pick it all apart. It was, everything was so up and down. And all the while I'm like, I'm still trying to do music. I'm still trying to, me and my partner are still trying to like make our relationship work. And I'm just, it's like a magnifying glass came down on me, and every little thing that I knew existed inside of me or didn't know existed inside of me was just amplified.
Mm-hmm. And this spiraled until September 2017.
September 2017. What is that?
Oh, sorry. You said October, actually.
Well, yeah. So, I had tried to get sober again after my dad had passed away. And this time I tried to go and I tried to turn to my culture. This is what I tried to do. I tried to turn to my culture, and I went and I sweat. I went to sweats, and I started at the beginning of summer, and I sweat until the end of the following spring. And this is another part of my story that I'm not exactly 100% proud of at all, because I wasn't doing it right. I wasn't doing it right. There are certain protocols and there are certain rules when you do these things, and I wasn't following them. Well, there's sort of like rules and protocols around substance use and ceremony, and I wasn't following them. I was breaking the rules, and so it wasn't long before, I stopped going to sweats. The person I was sweating with sort of gave me a choice and was like, your choice now is like, because the person I was sweating with, he knew what I was doing, and he let me still come, because he was trying to help me. Mm-hmm. And he kind of got me to a point, because his thing for me was that I didn't make decisions. That was one of his big things, is I lacked self-discipline. And I didn't make any decisions. So he put a decision on me, and he said, this is your choice right now. He said, you keep sweating with me and you step into your role as a ceremonial person. Or, and he said, and you can't be a ceremonial person if you're still drinking and you're still smoking. He said, that's option one. Option two is, you keep doing that. And he said, and there's nothing else that I can do for you at this point. And so I just left. I stopped going to ceremony. I let the booze and I let the drugs completely take over again, completely. And yeah.
So what finally did it for you?
Well, I mean, what finally did it for me? There wasn't one specific thing that really did it for me. From the time that I realized that I had a problem, well, not even realized, the time that I admitted that I was an alcoholic and I had a problem, to when I finally decided to sober up was probably about a whole year. There was a whole year there where I was aware of what I was doing. Mm-hmm. And my first daughter was born in that time, and I was drinking and like using throughout the whole first year of her life, and I wasn't really present for her, when she was a baby. And I sort of let my partner take all the responsibility there. We ended up spending a summer apart. So we moved back to Saskatoon after my daughter was born. My daughter was about 6 months. We moved back to Saskatoon, and then we spent a summer apart because I was yeah, I was so reckless, you know? I was so reckless and I was so careless and it was so unmanageable. And so I had some summer festivals booked in Calgary, and they were a couple of weeks apart, and there was about 4 festivals that I was playing, and in the Calgary area. So I left my partner and my baby in Saskatoon, and I went and I stayed with my mom at the trailer she was living in Calgary, and I played these shows, and I was drunk from the time I was up to the time I passed out. I had, oh yeah, those were some really dark times for me, and I wanted so badly to be, I wanted to be a better partner. I wanted to be a better dad. I wanted to be a better human being. I didn't want my daughter to grow up with the same experiences that I did. And I didn't want to be the same sort of partner to my partner, Nevada, as my dad was to my mom. I mean, my dad was a good man, but he had his demons, and he was not always his best. And I didn't want that. And so finally, after my summer of playing summer shows and just being drunk and staying drunk, I got roofied while I was out there because I was greedy and I was just taking free drinks from people one night at a bar. And, there's all this kind of crazy stuff that happened in that time. And I got back home, and my partner and I really, we started facing a lot of the things that were existing in our relationship, because we had been together, we had been together since, since we were 17. And she never knew me sober. That's the thing, is like, the person that she's with today is very different from the person that she got with, And so we faced a lot of the issues that were there, a lot of which were caused by me. We started facing them. And then it was the choice, right? Then it was the choice. It was get better or lose everything. That was the choice that I was faced with. And so October 5th of 2017, I decided to get help.
And what did that look like for you? Like, what was going, you made the decision. Did it feel like a weight was lifted, or was it like, oh shit, what do I do now? Like, was it...
Yeah, there was no weight lifted, man. There was no weight lifted. The weight got heavier.
Yeah.
The weight got so much heavier. Actually, I think
and that's interesting.
2018.
That's interesting. They say the booze wasn't the problem. The booze was the solution.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Life is my problem. Life's always been my problem, you know? And so my first year in recovery was so up and down, it was so up and down. I had moments where I remember, like, the first 3 weeks of being sober, I felt invincible,
Yeah. Oh, the pink cloud.
The pink cloud. Yeah.
I rode that bitch like a Harley.
Yeah, me too. Until I crashed it. Until the Harley crashed. And then,
oh, fuck me.
And everything was terrible. Everything was terrible. But where I decided to go is I found what I needed comes from 12-step recovery. That's where I found what I needed. And so I really made a point to lay that as my new foundation. I heard somebody say something about 90 and 90.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I did. That's exactly what I did, because I would look around and I would see people, where I was like, there's no way that you've been sober for 30 years.
Yeah.
There's no way. There's no way you're sober for a year, let alone 30.
Yeah. Oh, I remember. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But, one of the things is that once I made the decision to get into recovery, I made the decision. There was no, you know, there was no 1 foot out the door for me.
Yeah.
You know, because of where I came from, because of the trauma that I had lived through, because of everything, I did not want that to be a part of my family's life. And I didn't want to be that stereotype. You know, I didn't want to be that statistic, you know,
Yeah.
because I had been stereotyped and I had been put into statistics since the day I was born, you know. My options when I was growing up was people told me you're either going to be dead or in jail. That was what it was. And guaranteed I'd be addicted to what? Who knows? But, you know, you're going to be
It's gonna
addicted.
be something.
Exactly. Can you explain 90 and 90, please? 90 and 90 is sort of referencing going to 90 12-step recovery meetings in 90 days. And so I guess the logic behind that is that it takes that long to kill an old habit and then set in a new one. And so I blew that 90 and 90 out of the water. I think at the end of it, I was like 126 and 90. And, you know, that my ego felt good about that. I was like 3-4 a day, you know, like.
Yeah. And then the ego manifests in a whole new way. Now it's like, look how good I can recover.
Yeah, exactly. Look how sober I am.
I am so sober right now. Oh my God. The best at being sober.
But it was incredible because the people that I was meeting, you know, and the people that I was, you know, what I consider now to be blessed, the people I was blessed to be meeting, those people saved my life.
Yeah.
You know, just by being them, and accepting me, that saved my life, man. Like, and for the first time, I remember feeling like safe.
So what did it feel like doing things that other people told you to do and being grateful to have them tell you that?
Well, I think I was faking it for a really long time.
Okay.
I was faking it, you know.
Like in your recovery?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The fake it till you make it, you know. Yeah. I absolutely was doing that because I knew that that they were right. I knew that if I wanted what they had, I had to do what they needed, what they said to do. But I'm so just like rebellious by nature. So I'm fighting with myself. And so I was just like, you know what? If somebody pisses you off, don't say anything. Let it seethe. But at least if they think that you're responding well to it, pray that's all that matters. Yeah, pray for them. Exactly.
Oh,
yeah.
I used to hate that. Oh, I'll pray for them, all right.
Yeah, that's the spiritual FU right there.
Yeah,
you
totally.
know? That's like when somebody says, bless your heart, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Or I had mentorship in my early recovery, and he would say things like, because I was like, I'm gonna go get a girlfriend, and he'd be like, don't do it. I'm like, I'm gonna do it. He's like, you know what? Go do it. Just don't use when it doesn't work out and call me.
Yeah, exactly. You know, here's one of the biggest things that happened to me when I came into recovery. I had a lot of secrets. You know, I had a lot of secrets that nobody knew. You know, when I talk, you know, my grandma and my dad, they died without knowing these secrets. And so the first time that I ever opened up about my secrets was when I was sober for, you know, maybe 2-3 weeks. And I started calling my relatives, you know, that had kind of been estranged from for a while. I started calling them and telling them that I was being sexually abused by one individual from about the age of 11 to about 16. And that was really difficult. It was really difficult because I didn't realize how much about why I was the way I was stemmed from there. Because I never talked about it. you know? And so when I got into recovery, that was one of the things that just started, it was so bright, you know, it was in the front of my mind all the time. And I realized then and there, when, you know, when that started happening, when I couldn't drown these thoughts out, why I drank so much, you know, why I used so much, why I did absolutely everything in my power I could to distract myself and to just get rid of any thoughts. And it was because I hadn't faced any of this trauma. I hadn't talked about any of this trauma. I hadn't talked really about how, you know, there was some physical abuse that I had been enduring. I hadn't talked about really I hadn't talked to anyone about how being in my household affected me. Like I didn't talk about any of this stuff.
And now you are.
I try to talk about it as openly as possible, you know, because I spent so long feeling silenced. And I think to not talk about it now would sort of be betraying the person I'm becoming now. And the person I'm becoming now is confident, you know. I'm not ashamed. I'm not ashamed of stuff that I went through. I'm not ashamed, you know, to talk about my sexual abuse. I'm not ashamed to talk about the fact that I did terrible things to people because of it. But the difference is now is that I made the decision to work on it and to become better, you know.
That's amazing. Tearing me up a little bit. So tell us what's Forrest up to now? I mean, you have videos on YouTube, you have an amazing voice. I mean, your music is so well done. Like this did not happen in somebody's basement, man. Like what's happening with you, man? Like this is good stuff.
You know, I had put out a record in 2017, you know, and it's called The Valley. And that was a record that I put out. And the whole thing is really just a story about, you know, I wrote that record drunk. You know, that whole record I wrote drunk. And it's really sad. And there's a lot of songs in there about my grandma and a lot of songs in there about my dad. And I think what ended up happening was once I sobered up, you know, there was a lot of fear regarding music and sobriety. Because at that point, you know, I had never performed sober. I had never written songs sober. It was completely foreign territory for me. And so thinking about, you know, some of my heroes, you know, talking about like Steve Earle and talking about like Graham Parsons and talking about, you know, Keith Richards, you know, some of the like most notorious users of substances in rock and roll and projecting that stereotype, I couldn't imagine, you know, not being high when I wrote, not being drunk when I wrote, not being high or drunk when I performed. But the only way that I can really describe what happened with the music was that everything snapped into focus. You know, I could sing better. I could play guitar better. I understood language better. I understood imagery better and the power of a voice. And, you know, I really started to care. I really started to care about my craft. Because at that point, I mean, I always said like I could see myself being a musician. That's all I wanted to do. But like the only thing that I could ever really put effort into was making sure that I, you know, got my next drunk or got my next high. And all that effort started really, just going into honing my craft. And the first song that I ever wrote in sobriety is a song that's on my record, As the Stars Explode. It's called Better Days. Because that record too, As the Stars Explode, it really is a time capsule. You know, it's a time capsule there. It basically starts, the writing on that record starts from when my grandma died until I got sober. You know, and so the first song on that record I ever wrote sober was Better Days. And that song is so important to me because I did it, and I did it sober. And it was unlike anything that I had ever written. I was actually starting to be able to take what I heard in my head and get it out into the world, which was always a problem for me when I was writing and performing. It was almost like there was this separation, and then it sort of just came into this place where I was just like, well, it doesn't sound like I wanted it to, but that's fine, So I was sort of just like accepting that I wasn't as good as I wanted to be. But that all changed. That all changed in sobriety, man. Everything just got better.
They want to hear a song, buddy.
We can do that. I don't know if I have any guitars around.
Those ones are just, oh, look at it. It's right there. It's handy.
Yeah. How's that sound? Does that sound okay?
Sounds all right.
All right. So yeah, I'm actually going to play that song for you, Better Days.
I was hoping you would, man.
All right. Hit the ground running. I've been to hell and back. I've had my loved ones taken, and I felt my spirit crack. I tried to find salvation in crowded, rowdy rooms, smiling through the pain and washed my sorrows down with booze. And I don't know what happened, still not sure what changed. When the devil comes knocking, I turn the other way. And I'm doing better these days. Never thought I'd ever make it to see this age. Through the fire and through the rain, felt the same old way. Enough is enough, gotta get back up and hold on to see those better days. I climbed the highest mountain, fought a raging sea. I tried to lose myself, but couldn't get away from me. I got a lovely family, I made lots of mistakes, but I turned around since yesterday, so I'm innocent today. And I don't know what happened, why I'm still around. I guess some of us just need to get lost before we're found. And I'm doing better these days. Never thought